I mean, the idea cropped up when it actually happened because I had gone to that concert. And it was just such a great story. And it's one that anyone who is part of the classical music world in Philadelphia is probably familiar with. And people who were part of the libraries at the University of Pennsylvania and the music department of Pennsylvania are familiar with. And that was the discovery of this missing autograph manuscript of Bela Bartók's Third String Quartet, which debuted in Philadelphia in 1928. And then the person who found it was Otto Albrecht, who the music library is named after. And he's kind of this manuscript hunter. And he had been trying to track down all of the kind of major European autograph manuscripts, many of which had gone to many corners of the world after World War II to protect them, because they were going to be destroyed during the war, or because the Nazis found stuff, especially like Bartók, degenerate and would have destroyed it. So Otto Albrecht did this kind of phenomenal service of like tracking a lot of these down. He himself had actually been at that concert in 1928, so he knew that it had taken place in Philadelphia. It was sponsored by a Philadelphia organization, the Philadelphia Musical Fund Society. This was all rather like dry, local classical music stuff. But he found it, and then he brought it to Penn. And I feel like I dropped your question. I just started off in a digression. What about
No,
why was I there that night?
well, no, it's like so you've got this great story, right? And this is at the basic level what a journalist, what a features writer, what a magazine journalist is looking for. They're looking for a story
And it kind of
that,
became a problem for me to have a story.
yeah. So you had a story and you had this idea. Was it going to be like a straight work of nonfiction? Like, here's a story about Bartók's missing manuscript and this amazing professor who saves the manuscripts all over the world, and Philadelphia and Transylvania and peasants in the countryside playing klezmer music. Like, is that what the first idea was? Like, that's where I'm going with this.
Yeah, yes. I mean, like when I recognized it like as an interesting story, but I guess, I mean, like what's relevant is that I was coming out of just having finished my first book, The Kingdom Under Glass. And that had made me think a lot about, because I'd worked on that for 6 years, and it was a narrative nonfiction that was more conventional in that I was trying to reconstruct events that had all happened, you know. And while I was working on Kingdom Under Glass, I just started really thinking a lot about the whole process of mimesis and representation and reconstruction in writing, and found that as much as I loved writing that book, and I really did, like I felt at the end of it that I was ready to do something different. And I think that I'll try and be as succinct as possible about the first book, about Kingdom Under Glass. Was about the taxidermist Carl Akeley, who had built these, the very famous dioramas that are in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, like the African Hall. And what was fascinating about him was that he was going to Africa to kill these species, giraffes, chimpanzees, gorillas, everything. He ultimately had an epiphany where he realized, like, this is insane. I shouldn't be doing this. But this was kind of like the thinking at the time in terms of like collecting information, collecting science. But the dioramas themselves, in terms of mimesis, representation, narrative, like how do we recreate the world? So a lot of what Avoid the Day has to do with a lot of the motives that I felt that drove me to write this book were questions that came out of realism, like realism had been challenged in fiction, and in the fine arts and in music, and by Bartók himself. So it became a question for me, like, oh, what would it mean to actually challenge realism in nonfiction, especially in the age of information, where it seems to me like so many stories, and a number of stories that I myself was writing, it felt like they just felt like stenography, like where you're going out and you're reporting on the world, and then you're trying your best to recreate, reconstruct what you've learned, kind of regurgitating it. But I felt like that, that's just it's almost Wikipedian, it's almost like, well, what's the difference between like a very pretty Wikipedia article and trying to do something different with how we experience the world? Anyway, back to the taxidermist quickly. He was doing his best work of verisimilitude. Like he was, the king of realism, and he was trying to replicate the natural world as excruciatingly, painstakingly as he could. But at the same time that Picasso in 1910 was rethinking this, like why should maybe we should look at things through a more subjective lens and just simply recreating and reconstructing an experience that somebody else had. What's the value in that? It's just the mirror. This is like a question that is always around. So that drove a lot of it kind of became a game for me, how to write Avoid the Day, and a lot of it came out of that.
So you heard the Bartók story and you said, this is my entrance into trying to trouble realism. Like you knew that this story was going to be the path that you took to say, like, I don't need to report, I need to reconstruct, or D and then re and then D again a couple of times. Indeed. Over and over. Yeah, a lot of deconstruct as it goes. But it was like those two things, they zapped for you in your brain
eventually.
So
when I first heard the story, I was like, oh shit, this is great. This is the story. This is a great story. I was actually already a big Bartók fan. I love Bartók. So I thought, this is fun. This would be a fun way to spend another 6 years. But then I got kind of depressed, and I started thinking, man, do I really want to spend like 6 years in Budapest and archives, like reading everything about Bartók? And is this going to be a biography? And is that what I want to do? And I decided very much no. And at first I started coming up with these like little rules for myself. I was like, okay, I'll do it, but I'll like my research methodology was I'll only do 6%. I'll do 6% about Bartók. And that way I'll get away from that whole stenography, regurgitating what I have processed. So I struggled with it for a while, like deciding how to like, set my own game into motion. Well, the more I read about Bartók, and I did do my homework, and I read more than I needed to about him. But like one of the things that's most fascinating about Bartók himself was that he was doing that same thing, because at that period in classical music, most serious art musicians were starting to question what they were doing as well. So, Stravinsky turned to Russian folk music. Debussy turned to Javanese folk music. Bartók turned to the Hungarian and Romanian folk music that could be found in Transylvania. And so he's really the first ethnomusicologist. And so he took his phonograph and he went up into the hills of Transylvania, and he met with these peasant musicians and folk musicians and recorded it, and then took it back home. And like me with my tapes, and like you go out and you have this experience and you record everything, and then you listen to it and you try to be faithful to it. But he started synthesizing it and transmuting it and that is what led to what was Bartók's new music. It's kind of like if it's a mashup, it's kind of like the first mashup. It's probably not really the first mashup, but I like to say that. It's like, it's a mashup of Vienna, like Beethoven, Mozart, and Brahms, and like, that tradition with this new, really crazy, interesting, very different music. And so I felt like, that resonated for me. I thought like, that's kind of what I want to do.
So excellent entry point. And then you've got this really big emotional thing on the other side, which is that your dad is in the hospital dying. And was this, I mean, this is like a kind of complicated question to ask, but was it a coincidence of time, or is it very much just like how, like in trying to resynthesize, one can resynthesize, in trying to synthesize this kind of new troubling the real, like you knew you were also going to talk about your dad regardless of the context, or was it like, I am writing this story and this is really what's occupying this chunk of my brain at the same time, and I can't separate those two things because the two things aren't separate
Right.
in what you were going through?
I love that. Yeah, that's a really good question. Um, yeah, I mean, that was not initially part of my strategy. It intruded itself into it at some point, but that again kind of probably went along with my strategy, my method, or the process that I felt like I was probably designing and inventing as I went along, putting it together. Like, how do I want to do this? And a lot of it was like, really like, I just like want to have fun. I want to enjoy while I'm writing. So, um, like, I think a lot of the ideas came out of like working and writing magazine stories and straightforward nonfiction for so long. And like, you'd have little ideas like, well, that'd be crazy if you did that, or how interesting to combine and mash up multiple stories, because if you're always on the hunt for stories, that had actually like crossed my mind early on, like how funny, like just to take two completely disparate characters, or because you, as a magazine writer, you're just constantly writing down story ideas. And then it occurred to me like, maybe it'd be funny to like combine a couple of different stories together at the same time. I don't know. That might be off the track, but it's sort of related with the dad question, because what I wanted to, I guess one of the ambitions was to try and document in the way that a nonfiction writer wants to, is to nonfiction is reality. And so to document what's really going on. And so, yes, my dad's terminal diagnosis and then dying did just happen to coincide with what was happening, with the assignment, and then like the subsequent trip to the Arctic to make the horror movie.
That's what happens next, by the way. You get to from Bartók to trip to the Arctic to
very natural, that old trope. I felt like I wanted to, and maybe this sounds like a little pretentious, but pretentiousness is definitely like one of like the ingredients I wanted to have in this. So it's like, I'm going to give myself permission to like include these things. So in documenting as a nonfiction writer, I'm more interested in perception as much as anything, and I wanted to include like everything that was going on in my head. I wanted to kind of have multiple voices or multiple instruments. So, in a quartet, you have kind of like multiple instruments, four instruments, like playing against each other, but playing the same thing. And I wanted to include kind of an exaggerated version of my perceptions as I was going through these kind of crazy adventures. Like, so I'm in Transylvania and I'm I'm following in the footsteps of the ghost of Bela Bartók as I travel through these little villages with these klezmer musicians, and we're jamming, or they're jamming. I was not jamming. They were jamming with these musicians. But I'm also carrying this other stuff that's in my head. So my dad is dying, and other things that I'm thinking about. And and then like the vast mood shifts and the substance stuff that I had going on at the time. And I don't know, it doesn't, like, in retrospect, it doesn't seem difficult, but at the time I remember feeling like, no, you have to keep that. You have to keep that and keep every kind of all the voices in my head, like, on the page, keep them together and see how they play together,
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things is there's very much a Jay the narrator, Jay the character narrator. Something interesting you just said was that you wanted to give yourself permission to like include your pretentiousness, maybe not your personal pretentiousness, but to allow space for that. And you're dealing with, uh, I think I used the phrase earlier, anticipatory grief. You're sort of preparing to deal with your dad's death, and you have a complicated relationship with him, and you're also wrestling with substance abuse use, and sort of a spectrum of that all at the same time. And it's not always a particularly flattering portrait of you, Jay. Do you think that um, what factored into that decision making? What was it that said, like, I'm gonna not always, I mean,
make myself look awesome?
yeah, you're the writer, you have total control over sort of
Yeah.
what you're putting on the page for yourself.
Yeah, I have strong opinion about that. I feel like it's like I like to identify myself as a writer, not an author. And that's because I feel like writing is a process, and it should stay open as a process. And one of the things that I eventually objected to in writing nonfiction, um, sometimes for magazines and journalism, is that there's this sensibility that we should always be right. So you would go through the fact checking process, and I would want to include like perceptions. Like, I mean, that's the thing that I'm primarily fascinated with and interested in, and is at the center of a lot of what I'm writing about. Um, I'm more interested in perception than I am in being right. And I think I don't think that the nonfiction writer needs to be an authoritative figure who's always the kind of like, East Coast writer from, whatever, East Coast writer going out into the world and reporting back and kind of being the smart ass who knows everything standing in the corner. That's a great artifice, because all of that knowing requires like an army of fact checkers and research, and like you can always go back and make yourself as knowing as possible. But again, I don't want to sound like a Wikipedia entry. I don't really feel that being, I think information, I'm, so therefore, if you're writing about reality and you're writing about perceptions and you're writing about what is the value of experience, I mean, that's one of my central questions as a writer, is like, what is the value of experience? Because that's what I'm doing. I'm like going out into the world, you're having an experience, you come back and you recreate it, or you recreate somebody else's experience. But why, who says the writer should always be right? So I think it's interesting to show yourself in, and it's also fun, or maybe I'm a masochist, but I mean, there's certainly a couple of scenes in the book, obviously, where I show myself just being an idiot. I mean, for me, it's funny. It's funny, but it's also like, that's part of reality. It's like, I am, I'm having my experience. I'm trying to understand this, and I botch it here, like here I botch it. So if I were to erase that, that just feels like an omission that, I don't need to airbrush myself.
Makes sense. I want to talk a little bit about the second movement, we'll say, of this book, where you are spending some possibly expensed money. I'm not here to rat you out to any magazine finance departments or anything, but you're hanging out in like a spa, kind of eerie spa, and sort of
Oh, we're not
along the
there
same.
yet.
Well, yeah, you're not.
We're in the
Oh, okay,
spa.
the spa. You're not at the spa. You're in Bucharest
A
when
great
you
idea
take.
yesterday for a book about spas. I thought, like, just speaking of like expenses, like that would be cool, wouldn't it? Just like do a book,
Yeah, I mean,
like
that's the.
at all the cultural spas of the world and like
I don't
travel.
know, just yeah, and I don't know if anybody pays for that anymore. I
Probably
think
not.
that's
I like,
probably, you could write it off. Um,
yeah.
so that would be enough, I guess.
Travel doesn't have travel anymore either. But you're right. Okay, I did. I like. You're right.
I don't. I'm.
You're
I'm
judging.
spot. I'm. I'm describing. I'm just. I'm an observer. Uh, but eventually, like, you sort of decide, like, I don't really like this story anymore. I am kind of done with this story. I don't know where you're at for the. I presume you had not yet written the Bartók piece for Harper's, which is very good. Anyone who has access to the archive should check it out. But you get a call from a friend. The timeline is not exactly right here, but around the same time where you give up, you get a call from a friend of yours, Darren,
Aaron.
invites you to the Arctic on a luxury cruise. Um, uh, would in like, let's say you weren't writing a book, would you have said yes and just maybe put that in a second story? Do you think? Like,
Yeah,
I'm going either way.
I went back and forth with that like forever. Even after I sold the book with those two as the mashup, I feel like that's the mashup. Um, I was still trying to like convince my agent, like, can we just sell this as two separate books? Because it really feels like two separate books. But my original vision was to combine them. And as insane as it sounds, like I had that idea to combine them like well before we went to the Arctic. Because I felt like I had a sense of how they were connected in a way that was, tricky at best to get across in a book proposal. But you know, I guess some of the themes that connected being in Transylvania and the whole vampire thing, which I had initially promised Harper's magazine, like I promise I won't go anywhere near the whole vampire thing because that seems too cliche and silly. But then once I was in Transylvania, it was like you can't avoid this. And Bartók himself is kind of vampiric. He's going and he's like sucking the songs out of these like innocent folk musicians and peasants to like take their plasma to create his own genius work. And then in the Arctic, it's a vampire obviously has to avoid the sun, and I guess the sun is kind of like a metaphor for consciousness for me, something I was kind of also wanting to avoid, um, which might partly go a little bit toward explaining like some of the substance use and
Use.
use. Yeah. Um, and then in the Arctic, it's like when we were there in July, and it was 24-hour sunlight, midnight sun, which was part of the reason that we decided like, oh, we can get away with like doing a really low budget horror film, the guerrilla horror film, under the noses of the crew and the other passengers. Um, so yeah, I actually weirdly knew and had been planning for a long time, like a year, that we would do that, and that it would be part of the book.
That you're gonna go to the Arctic and film a guerrilla horror movie with your friend Darren, who's like making a pilot or like a spec uh travel show with you as the host. Was that the hope? Was that you were going to?
I was not the host. I was supposed to be the buddy. I mean, Darren and I had traveled to Rwanda a few years earlier for a story that I had done for GQ, and he had tagged along to make a travel documentary about the resurgence of the tourism there. And we're like very old friends, and we have kind of a interesting, prickly, insane relationship. And he's been everywhere in the world. Like he's done travel documentaries for all kinds of different cable TV shows, and like he was in Borneo and got bit by an orangutan. Like he was poisoned once when I don't know, it doesn't matter what country he was in, but I mean he's like the perfect travel companion, and we always enjoyed that kind of stuff. He had been a videographer for that cruise line for Lindblad. And so he had some ins, and yeah, we got ourselves on the ship and then decided that like it was way more fun to be running around in the middle of the night, like acting, even though we're obviously not actors, and trying to come up with this like horror movie plot we had like 9 days on the ship. So I mean it was fun, but like the things that are combined in a serious way are kind of like the whole thing is an essay on fear. I mean, I guess that's like the serious element of what connects part one and what connects part two. I mean, I do feel that they're very connected. And yeah, movement one, movement two. Frankenstein comes into play a lot in part two in the Arctic, which is, in Frankenstein, it's kind of like bookended in the Arctic where the monster is kind of chased to the end of the world, and I'm kind of chasing my own sense of myself as a monster. They come out, they felt
Yeah,
like they belonged together.
and you sort of have that sort of double bookending going on too in the book. You've got the vampire at the beginning, and it's like Monster Mash, that kids movie, teen movie from the 90s.
Sure.
Vampire and Frankenstein going on at the same time.
Really monsters, and I think that's like where the father comes in too, because like the central piece, so there's the third string quartet by Bartók, but then there's also this cantata profana, which is a piece that he described as being kind of like the key to his entire art. And it's the only piece he wrote that has that he wrote the libretto to. He only did a few choral pieces, and it involves this Romanian, very local Transylvanian myth about the father and the 9 magnificent stags, which is almost a perfect parallel to the Greek myth of I'm going to lose it now, Diana, and where his sons turn into these stags. His sons, he's an old man, and his sons are kind of dumb. They're not really prepared to do anything in the world except hunt and drink. And one day they go out into the woods and they find a magical pool and they drink from it, and they're transformed into these 9 magnificent stags. And then he pursues them and he tries to kill them. And then as he's about to shoot them, like the kind of eldest son, who's the baritone, kind of sings out to his father, like, don't shoot his father, lets him know, like, we're your sons, but we also can't come home. Our antlers have grown too great to come back into your house. And so it's kind of like this like really heartbreaking father-son story, about the power struggle between fathers and sons. And that's what resonated for me with my father and me. That's, like a lot of the way that the book is organized is thematically like that, and also because it's the cantata profana, it's sacred. and like this relationship between the sacred and the profane is like a big part of the book. And my father, which we haven't mentioned during this chat, is he's a Methodist minister. He was a man of the cloth. He's a holy man, and but one who kind of like turns his back. He avoided his own calling, I think. But that was always like my kind of like bone to pick with my father. Like, it's like, why would you pick a job and then kind of not embrace it, you know? And which I feel is important for myself as a writer. I'm like, I want to take it seriously. I mean, I think it's important. I think it has value. So
Even
that's,
as you wrestle with what that value necessarily like what it is that you're doing, like the motive.
yeah. Because I mean, I think like after, you know, you live for a few years, you start looking at what you're really doing and you're like, does this have value? And like, so, I mean, I certainly felt that way, like going out and you have an experience, you write about someone else's experience, like, you know, does experience have value? Why does it have value? And then I think the thing that I started to really drilling down to is like, well, like, you know, that like you go out and you have like the raw experience, right? So it's like, this is what I did. I'm hanging out in Transylvania. We saw these musicians. We did this, that, and the other. It's raw material, but then it becomes the story. Story is different than narrative. And so it's like, how does narrative has more to do with the how do we tell the story? Like, how do we shape it? How do we order it? How do we order and arrange the experience? How do we make choices? How do we select which bits of the experience of the raw material? How do we choose it? How do we select for it? And then how does the way we translate that experience through narrative and all of like the choices that can be made and the tools of narrative like generate meaning? And for me, after a while, it felt like it could be almost automatic. Like, you'd write a story and then you'd put it all together and you'd have moments of epiphany where you think like, oh, cool, you know, it's fun. I mean, like this connects with this connects with this, and you have, it feels like it echoes or it feels like it's resonant. And I think that's an experience that all writers and artists have, where you have a sense of like, these things connect, and that moment of connection feels like meaning, or what we call meaning. And then the more I delved into that, the more self-conscious I was of my own process. And I guess this is the experimental part. I started questioning how it is that storytelling itself generates meaning, and how that meaning can become fixed. And then I thought, well, what if we just start asking different questions and more questions so that we can keep that open? And so back to the narrative, if narrative is largely about the how do we order this experience? How do we shape it? How do we interpret it? And our interpretations are our perceptions, you know? If we can keep that open longer, or order it in different ways, you'll realize that you actually come up with different meanings. And what does that say? And so that made me kind of like, it's a little paranoid, but I think it's also pretty legitimate that there's just an element of automaticity, like that, like generating meaning can feel too automatic in writing a story, because of the way those things fit together and the way things connect, and you get that spark because of the way you've ordered them. So if you order and arrange and interpret them in a different way, or allow yourself to interpret the experience in a different way, you can come up with new meanings, or maybe unfixed meanings, or maybe just an openness, which I personally feel is something that we need more than anything else. Like, I feel like we need less fixed meaning. I feel like we need fewer narratives that nail everything into place. I feel like we need space. And I wonder if storytelling, which is, like, I think we all kind of know, is the oldest way that humans kind of organize our experience and create meaning out of it. The most extreme version being conspiracy theories, right? Like that's a kind of storytelling. It's like, oh man, these things connect, so therefore it must have meaning. It's very electric. It doesn't mean it's right. So I feel like part of my own personal motives as a writer now is to definitely never be authoritative, and to just like see if I can play around with it and keep it open as much as I can, because I feel like that quality of emptiness or space feels really valuable to me, and that's the thing that I want to inhabit as a writer, like more than anything.
And it's interesting not to pull daddy issues specifically back into this, but sermons are literally a narration for meaning. Like that's, and it's you're getting a meaning from that. Like
Yeah.
it's so you're trying to complicate that, which I think is really interesting. So I'm going to start pulling in some of the questions from the YouTube, because I think we're getting some pretty insightful one. So we have Janet. Hi, Janet, who's asking, does the reader's perception the reader's perception is part of meaning? So like us, the audience, me, Allie, and Janet, are we making meaning from what you're saying, what you're writing?
Yeah, I would say, yeah. I mean, it's like a reader response theory, right? Like where, I mean, whatever I'm writing or whatever anyone is writing, it's taking place in the reader's mind. It's definitely completed in the reader's mind, and the reader is the one where those connections and everything takes place. Yeah, I'm like definitely a strong. I think that's half the game, and that's what you're. I mean, that's definitely what you're largely trying to figure out in dialogue, like hoping like, well, how will this land with the reader? Um, how will this either, and this is an XFIC question that, that's kind of part of that the manifesto of the questions on XFIC is like, do I want to reassure the reader or do I want to destabilize the reader? And if I want to destabilize the reader, why? Yeah, like what purpose does it have? Like why would someone want to read it? And I mean, and I get that from my own experience as a reader, like I want to have myself, sometimes I want to be reassured that what I already believe is like worthwhile. And sometimes I want to be destabilized and I want to see something new. I want to think differently. I want to have like new thoughts, not new thoughts that are complete introduced to me, but I want to have new opportunities to generate new meanings for myself.
And so you're resisting the urge over and over again, I think, to provide what is the neat narrative, the flowing, like, I'm writing a magazine story, I'm done with a magazine story, this feels good, this is like neat, I have a package, it's out in the editor's hand and they're gonna to verify that. What are you doing when you're unsettling us the readers, me, the rest of us? Like what's the hope in that unsettling?
The unsettling, I think maybe just like embracing contradictions that show up and not trying to enforce like one consistent interpretation, and allowing, like what I was talking about earlier in terms of like having different voices that kind of speak at the same time. You allow the contradictions to kind of clash together, and I think that's fun, because it's like, one of my, yeah, that's one of my favorite things as a reader myself.
We have Eileen asking, related to this all, how much do you imagine a specific reader when you're writing and making these narrative choices? Do you have a reader in mind? Do you have readers in mind?
Yeah, I only have one reader, and that's Julie, my wife. Actually, she's like my main reader, and like she's like the most ferocious one. Yeah. So yeah, I have a reader. And I am lucky enough to live with her.
So back to Julie, actually, who is awesome.
True.
True. Shout out to Julie, who is maybe watching this on the porch while eating pizza. This book is a lot about fatherhood. We have Anissa asked this question, and it came up for me too. This book is a lot about fatherhood, and it's a lot about family. And you are a father. Is there like, did you make a decision? What was the decision making that said like, I'm not going to engage with that part of this? Like, I'm
Yeah,
not going to
it's
talk
really,
about being a dad.
I did a book club thing a couple of weeks ago, and somebody asked the same question. That's really, I mean, it's the same reason that my mom's not in it a lot, you know, like the, I don't, well, I'm like stumbling over how to answer this. She, in terms of the story itself, there was no purpose for me to say like, oh, I'm a dad, you know what I mean? Or that like I'm also, when I was away, because I mean that was like honestly just as painful as anything, like because Ruby was 5 when, oh no, she just turned 5. Because I came back from Hungary, from Romania, uh, like a couple of days before her 5th birthday. And like, I was definitely like homesick for her, you know, but that's my life. That's not the story. The story is the story. And maybe I'm just a little cold hearted that way, but it's also the same reason that like, you know, my mom's not in it a ton, because it's like, I'm good friends with my mother and I love her. And I think like, one of the choices you can make is to protect people and to not, you know, there's no muck to muck around in there. There's no conflict. And like, I want it to be entertaining as much as anything. And like, I think an entertaining story usually involves a degree of conflict. And there was enough conflict in the piece there with me and my father and my own crazy thoughts and Darren, you know, I didn't need to include my kid and my mother. So that's why, you know. And
Yeah,
you don't include everything in your story.
you wanted to keep only the people who you are in an antagonistic situation with here.
I guess if that's the way you want to look at it, sure. Yeah, that's a good answer.
Um, yeah, it's interesting because it's hard when you care or love about when you care and love your family to make those kinds of decisions. Like, of course, they're a huge part of your life, and is your life the story, or is it the story? And
Yeah.
here the story is the story.
The
Um,
my mom is in, it's like she's kind of, you know, she's a heroic figure. She's like the helper. You need to have those different figures of like the people who help you, not only the people who are your antagonists.
yeah. Um, we have another question. This is connected to some of the process that we talked about earlier. Donovan says, I wonder if we might think of it as akin to, and this is back talking about just how you compose, sort of think of it as akin to autofiction, like an auto nonfiction. Um, the book is your attempt to write the book. Would you say that that's kind of a fair description, a little bit of the process? A lot of fingerprints on the finger painting. That's not a normal thing that someone would say. Paintbrush strokes on a
Yeah,
painting.
I think I definitely at some point, you know, I worked on this book for a ridiculously long time. Um, and at some point I definitely realized, I was like, oh, I think this, you know, I became aware of autofiction. That became a thing while I was writing this book. And I definitely identified with it. I thought like this is, but it's not fiction.
Yes. So auto nonfiction would
I
be
don't know.
the auto nonfiction is the
But I think
Donovan's term.
I think it feels like maybe it's, I don't know. I mean, maybe it fits in with that zeitgeist of autofiction, where I feel like maybe, I'm guessing, the autofiction writers are feeling that fiction itself is no longer quite adequate in the world we live in. I don't know. That sounds insulting to fiction writers. So I take that back, Allie. I withdraw.
You can have your beef with novelists.
No, I just mean that like reality is such a trip now that,
We have a question from Cyril who wants to know about the title. How are you avoiding the day? What is it to avoid the day? They didn't write that. That's my editorial on that.
You're interpreting Cyril's question.
Cyril's question is, can you tell us a word about the title?
Oh, the title. All right. So it's more Saul Bellow than it is Pynchon.
That is the least clarifying thing I've heard in a really long time.
Okay. Avoid the day. I guess it's what a vampire would like to do. A vampire would like to avoid the day. And then in the end, okay, so I think that I'm avoiding the thing that I want the most.
And so for a vampire, that is death, sweet death.
I changed my answer.
Just you. Okay,
so I'm avoiding the thing that I want the most, which is a very deep contradiction, Cyril. I recognize that. But the thing that I want the most is direct experience. I want to not avoid the day. But that's a long title. It's silly. I want to make direct.
I want to not avoid the day.
Like when I had the naked raw notes of Bartók like burning a hole into my leg when I was sitting in that office in Budapest. It was like I was too close to it, too close to like the direct thing itself, the thing in itself.
That's the garlic, to go back to the vampires that we've abandoned. That's the poignant moment. We're gonna end in about 5 or 10 minutes. So if you have more questions, keep them coming. We will get to them. What happened? So I have a question, Allie. What happened to the horror movie? Some of it is in the trailer. That's, you see in this beginning scene that we played before the program started. You've got an empty cruise ship and some creepy horror vibes, but you filmed like a good amount of footage, I assume, on this 9-day no sunsetting trip. Will there be a horror movie out that we can all watch?
My friend Darren, who's the main character in that part of the book, has actually went on to complete a movie that's now called Dissonance. And if there were film festivals taking place right now, it would be out. So I don't know exactly when it will be out, or we have some half-baked plans for maybe doing some sort of synergistic collaboration where maybe, we'd have a conversation like this about the book and show the movie and then talk about the backstory. It was kind of insane. I mean, like, we spent a week on the ship filming this guerrilla horror film. And he had like an enormous amount of material in the end. He's a great filmmaker, so it looked gorgeous. And except for the acting, the acting terrible. But he got some real actors in the end, and wrote a screenplay version of it. And so there's this kind of parallel existence, this parallel alter story. So I haven't even seen it yet, so I don't know. I hope it doesn't. I hope it doesn't make it look too bad.
Like a double fiction, a fiction stacked on a fiction of your experience.
I hope it doesn't make me look too bad. I'm sure it's great, but it'll be out. It'll be out soon, but I don't know when. I mean, it's just
he can't like cook you up with a DVD so you can see it?
Terrified. He was terrified to read my book. I don't think he didn't admit that to me until after he read it, but after he read it, he was pretty happy. But he was really scared that I was going to like completely decimate him in the book, and so maybe I have like some of the same fears because I know like one of the characters in the movie is like supposed to be my character on the ship. So
Have you seen who plays you in that?
yeah, I know I forget the actor's name, but I know who it is. Yeah.
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That's got to be like a complicated feeling.
Oh.
So we do have a couple questions. Jzeroff PhD, probably J Zaro PhD. Now that I've looked at that name all across, says that there's a lot of laugh out loud moments. And you've talked a bit today about like really being intentionally funny during this. Like, how did you want to be funny for entertainment, or was it like funny because you're funny because you felt like the story needed it?
What? Wait, what?
That's not what the question is. The question is
Because I'm
something
funny?
about humor in the book. Jay Zared PhD wants to know about humor in the book. Like what are you doing with it? What's the magic there?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, there's probably more humor in the second movement where we're on the ship, right? And that's probably just a result of my friend Darren and I hanging out and being kind of jackasses, you know, which is another voice in the book. It's like, I don't know. I mean, I'm amused by a lot. I find life to be absurd and funny. So I don't know if it's like funny or humor. I mean, I feel like humor is just on everything, like just like the more you observe things, things are just kind of like humorous, largely because they're absurd, or maybe that's a way of dealing with stuff or avoiding things. I don't know. I don't know. You're the cartoon, Allie. You're like a professional comic. You should answer this one, not me. I don't know.
I fall back on humor as a crutch too. So I can't
Really,
say
it's
anything.
always a weakness. It's like I fall back on it as some kind of.
I'm not saying you do. I'm saying I do. So I can't speak to you using it because it's definitely not like there's no way for me to say how I would use humor. I don't think that that's what's happening in the book. I think the book is really funny because life is absurd and funny. But when I use humor, that's what I'm doing.
Okay.
That's my mode.
Right.
We have another question from Kurekwashe, who says, did you get any insight of what you did not want to write about from the experience of writing the book? Or did you get any insight on what you'd want your next project to be?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's a great question. The new book that I'm writing is very much kind of a part of this project that I feel I began with Avoid the Day, where I feel like I am writing more in my own genuine voice. Like I feel like I've discovered a place where I really want to exist as a writer. And the new book has a lot to do with the same level of skepticism, for lack of a better term, that I was discussing earlier, where I feel like looking at how we construct narrative kind of determines and generates meaning out of the experience, out of the material that we're trying to write about. And the new book that I'm working on is like even more so about that. It's more so about what if we were to outsource our own interpretations? What if we were to outsource meaning itself rather than allowing it to be only, local to my skull? Like I think of, this is another part of XFIC, one of the XFIC questions, like how can we challenge received ideas? I feel like for myself, that's one of the most important things to do now, is to challenge like the ideas that just happen to be going through my head, and to say like, well, where did that idea, not to trace it, but like, where did the idea come from? And just because it's taking place in my head, does that mean it's valuable? I don't know. And so what if we were to, so I'm taking a very radical choice. What if we were to outsource meaning itself? What if we were to outsource our own intention as an artist? So yeah, I'm definitely continuing down the same path, which I hope works out.
Did you grab on a story for that? Are you, what do you think? What is your sort of hook with that? What are you investigating?
My hook with that involved like a massive explosion with the New York Times Magazine for a story. But again, I knew it was going to be a book before I actually, did the magazine story, but it's okay.
And so David asks, like, will the new book be new nonfiction as well? Is
Yes.
that how you're?
I don't know what the subtitle will be. It's called Random.
A new.
A new. Was that
a new squared?
Yeah. I do have a working title for it, if anyone cares. It's called Random.
We all care.
You all care? Okay, then I'll tell you. It's called Random Event Generator.
That's a good one. That's a good working title.
Thank you.
We have one more question. This is from Helen. Confession. This is Helen confessing. Confession, I haven't read the book, but I intend to. You mentioned addiction, and I've read that benzos were involved. Were you more creative while using? Did things come to a halt when you got clean?
Wait, benzos were involved. Did things come to a halt? Oh, I see. Like, did I depend on those particular substances for my creativity? No, not at all. If anything, I feel like I'm much more creative and much more able to be directly involved in my own life and my own feelings, which was certainly something that I have tried to avoid. So by not doing them, I feel like I'm more directly, maybe closer to the thing that I guess I ultimately want, even though it's difficult, right? But that's a compassionate question, and thank you.
And we have one more question from Jayla. In this interrogation of ideas, does the writing process turn into a sort of mindfulness exercise or meditation? What is this process? It feels very meta, is what Jayla says.
Yeah, I think meta is a very appropriate term, because I feel like the methods that I'm using as a writer come from, I mean, there's, I've been a little shy about the term experimental nonfiction, because like I feel like the term experimental can sound like it'll be too deliberately or willfully weird or willfully different, or different just for the sake of being different. But a lot of the ways that I've tried to realign myself as a writer have come out of very organic, authentic questions that I have as a person and as a writer, and from the observations that I make about the kind of automatic nature that stories have in terms of generating meaning. And yeah, I hope I answered that properly.
Do you think, this is sort of a question to move towards wrapping things up, and do you think that you'll re-engage with sort of this more traditional magazine writing, or do you think that you're making like a break for yourself? Like, I want to think outside of this space and stick to places where you can sort of flex these new narratives, or do you think you'll be returning to the, like, I'm going to be in this archive for the next 6 years, smelling paper and touching objects, touching old cigarettes or whatever?
I think I have very happily made the break.
Awesome. So thank you, Jay, very much.
Thank you so much, Allie.
This is Avoid the Day. You can buy it the link below through Harriet's on Bookshop. Tell your friends about it. Tell your friends' friends. I just want to say tomorrow we have another awesome program. We have Kylie Reed and student staffer Kalia Dorsey will be talking to her on the same YouTube. So like and subscribe, which is hard for me to say, but you'll get more alerts about more programs. And I just want to thank you one more time, Jay, for being here, for being involved in this, and for teaching experimental fiction, nonfiction, experimental nonfiction to all the young people in the creative writing program who are interested. I'm sure that the students are doing some really interesting things under your tutelage.
Thank you so much, Ali. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks, Jay. And you can share this. This is going to be available immediately. So if you want to go back and see the play-by-plays every moment, they're there for all of you. So thanks.